The nurse had just dimmed the lights over the bed when Camille's phone buzzed against the tray table, and she answered it the way she had answered every call from Bennett for 8 years. Before the second ring, a reflex she'd never managed to unlearn. She thought, for one foolish second, that maybe someone had told him, that maybe he'd heard the word the cardiologist had used that afternoon, the word that had made the resident go quiet and start speaking more slowly, and that he was calling to say he was on his way, that he'd left the office, that he was already in the parking garage. She actually pressed the phone harder to her ear, wanting it. Cam. Finally. Listen, the Delaney's moved dinner up to tomorrow night, so I need you back home first thing. The whole main floor is a disaster, and you know how Sharon Delaney is about the powder room. There was a small pause on the line, the sound of him chewing something, a fork against a plate. He had ordered in. Of course he had ordered in. Bennett, she said. I'm in the hospital. I know. But you're being discharged tomorrow, right? So you'll be home by noon. That's plenty of time. Just don't let them keep you longer than they have to. You know they always try to pad it out for the billing. She lay there in the half-dark, wires taped to her chest, a monitor drawing green mountains of her own heartbeat above her head, and she waited for him to ask a single question. How are you? What did they say? Are you scared? She waited the way you wait at a bus stop in February, when you already know the bus isn't coming, and you stand there anyway because the alternative is admitting it. He didn't ask. He told her which caterer to call, and to have the good tablecloths pressed, and then he said he had another call coming in, and he'd see her tomorrow, and the line went dead in her hand. And that was the moment Camille Fortier decided she was not going home. Not the diagnosis. Not the fainting on the kitchen floor 3 days earlier, coming to with the toaster still ticking, and her cheek against the cold tile. Not even the years, though the years were the real weight. The sediment that had been settling in her for so long she'd stopped noticing the water rising. It was the powder room. It was Sharon Delaney's opinion of the powder room, spoken into the room where a doctor had just told her that her heart, the actual muscle in her chest, was failing in a way they needed to watch very closely. That was the thing that finally cracked it open. She set the phone face down on the tray. Above her, the green line kept climbing and falling, patient as a tide, and she watched it for a long time. Camille was 33. People who met her now assumed she'd always lived the way she lived. The house in Oakville with the 2-story foyer, the SUV she never drove past the grocery store, the dinners she hosted for men who called her husband Champ and forgot her name between the salad and the coffee. They couldn't have guessed that at 22 she'd been sleeving a rehearsal hall in Montreal at 11 at night, with rosin on her fingers and her cello on her back, that she'd had a spot in a chamber group and a teacher who told her she played the second movement of the Elgar like she'd lost someone. She had lost someone. Her mother, Odile, had died the winter Camille was 19, and Camille had poured all of it into the strings because there was nowhere else to put it. Then she'd met Bennett Cross at a fundraiser where she'd been hired to play, and he'd been the only person in the room who came up to the quartet afterward, instead of the bar. He'd told her she was wasted playing background music for people who didn't listen. He'd said it like a compliment, and she'd taken it like one. Within 2 years they were married, and within 3 she'd stopped playing, because his firm was growing and someone had to run the house, and there was always a dinner, always a client, always a reason that this month wasn't the month to pick it back up. The cello went into its case, and the case went into the closet under the stairs, and every so often, hauling out the vacuum, she'd knock against it in the dark and feel the hollow wooden knock go straight through her sternum. She had not touched it in 5 years. Her mother had done the same thing in her own way. Odile had been a bright, quick woman married to a man who narrowed her year by year until she was quiet, until she flinched at the sound of the garage door, until the only place Camille ever saw her fully herself was the 2 summers they'd driven east, just the 2 of them, to a fishing village in Nova Scotia, where Odile's own grandmother had come from. Camille had been 8 and 10 those summers. She remembered lupins growing wild in the ditches, purple and pink and white, taller than she was. She remembered her mother laughing on a wharf with a stranger, her head thrown back, 20 years younger for an afternoon. Then they'd driven home each time, back across the country to her father, and her mother had folded herself small again, and Camille had watched it happen and hadn't understood, at 8, at 10, that she was watching her own future being modeled for her. Odile died at 51. The doctors called it her heart. Camille, at 19, had thought that meant something medical. Now at 33, lying in a hospital bed while her husband worried about a powder room, she understood it had meant something else entirely. They discharged her the next day with a bag of medications so large the pharmacist double-checked the name on the label, and a follow-up appointment, and a stack of pamphlets about a condition she could barely pronounce, a cardiomyopathy, weakened muscle, an ejection fraction they wanted to keep an eye on. Manageable, the cardiologist had said, if she was careful. Serious but manageable, if her life allowed for rest and low stress and someone to help her. Camille had almost laughed at that. Someone to help her. She'd looked around the small room for the someone and found only herself. She took a taxi home because Bennett was in a meeting and couldn't come. And she carried the bag of medications through the two-story foyer, past the good tablecloths already pressed, and hanging over a chair where the housekeeper had left them, and she stood in the enormous quiet kitchen and understood that the dinner was still happening, that she was expected, that her collapse and her diagnosis had been, in the ledger her husband kept, a scheduling inconvenience. So she hosted the Delaney dinner. She would think about that night for a long time afterward, not because anything happened, but because nothing did. She moved through it the way you move through a dream where you've forgotten your lines and no one else notices. She plated the pavlova. She refilled Sharon Delaney's wine. She stood at the counter with a fixed, pleasant expression while the men talked about interest rates. And Bennett laughed too loud at things that weren't funny. And no one, not one person at that table, including the man she'd married, asked her how she was feeling. She'd been in a hospital 30 hours earlier. She'd worn a long-sleeved blouse to cover the tape marks and the bruise where the IV had blown. She'd smiled until her face ached, and afterward, loading the dishwasher at midnight with her chest tight, and her pulse doing something wrong and fluttery. She'd caught her own reflection in the dark kitchen window and had not recognized the woman looking back. It was around then, scraping pavlova into the green bin, that she noticed Bennett's phone lighting up on the island where he'd left it charging. She wasn't a snoop. In 8 years, she'd never once gone through his things. It hadn't occurred to her, the way it doesn't occur to you, to check whether the floor is still there when you walk. But the screen kept lighting up, again and again, insistent. And she was standing right there, and the name that surfaced through the glass was one she knew. Brielle, his new associate, 26, sharp, laughed at everything he said, had come to 2 of these dinners now, and helped clear the plates in a way that made Camille feel obscurely replaced. The messages that stacked up on the lock screen were not the messages of an associate. Camille didn't pick up the phone. She would remember being almost proud of that later, that she'd stood there with her whole marriage, lighting up in her hand, and hadn't touched it. She just read what was visible, one preview after another, until the screen went dark, and then she stood in the silence of her spotless kitchen and felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with her failing heart. She didn't cry. That surprised her most. She'd expected, if this ever came, a collapse, a scene, the kind of tears that leave you hollowed out. Instead, she felt strangely, terribly clear, the way the air gets clear right before real cold sits in. She looked at the tablecloths. She looked at the closet under the stairs, where her cello had been sleeping for 5 years. She looked at the pamphlet on the counter, the one that said rest, low stress, support, and she understood that she was going to die in this house. Maybe not this year, maybe not for 10, but she was going to die here the same way her mother had died, of a heart that everyone agreed was the medical problem, while everyone ignored the actual one. She went to bed in the guest room. She told Bennett, when he stumbled up hours later, that she didn't want to disturb him, that the doctors had said she'd be restless. He said, fine, whatever helps, and was asleep in 90 seconds. She lay awake until the windows went gray. By morning she had a plan, and the plan was very simple, and it was the first thing that had been entirely her own in 8 years. She was methodical about it, in a way that would have surprised the people who knew her only as Bennett Cross's pretty quiet wife. Over the next 2 weeks, she found a family lawyer in the city, not one of Bennett's friends, a woman in a small office above a Vietnamese restaurant on the east side, who listened to Camille's whole story without once looking at her watch. She learned things about her own marriage she hadn't known, that the account her mother had left her, the one Bennett had consolidated, years ago to make things simpler, was still, legally, half hers and then some, that the house had appreciated. That 8 years of running a man's entire domestic and social life had a value the court would recognize even if her husband never had. She didn't tell Bennett any of it. She hosted 2 more dinners. She smiled. She took her medications and rested when he was at the office and felt her heart, slowly under the treatment, begin to steady, as if it too had just been waiting for her to make up her mind. And then on a gray Tuesday in late October, she confronted him, not with rage. She'd rehearsed rage in the shower and found she didn't have the appetite for it. She simply told him she knew about Brielle and that she wanted a divorce, and she slid the papers across the marble island toward him, already signed on her side. She'd expected a lot of things. She had not expected him to laugh. Cam, come on. He pushed the papers back like she'd handed him a takeout menu. You're not well. You said it yourself. The doctor wants you to avoid stress. This, he gestured at the documents at the whole situation. This is exactly the kind of thing that's going to put you back in the hospital. Let's not do something we'll both regret because you found a couple of texts and got worked up. A couple of texts, she repeated. Brielle is a colleague. It's a high-pressure environment. Things get. He stopped, recalibrated, softened his voice into the tone he used on nervous clients. Where would you even go? You haven't worked in years. You can't drive more than 20 minutes without your chest acting up. Be reasonable. You need me. You need this house. You need the coverage. You need somebody keeping an eye on you. He said it gently, and that was the cruelest part, because he genuinely believed he was being kind. In his ledger, he was doing her a favor by refusing to let her leave. For most of her life, a speech like that would have worked. She would have looked for the flaw in herself, found it, apologized. She'd built her whole self around his assessment of her, and his assessment had always been that she was a lovely, delicate thing that couldn't survive without him. Instead, she looked at him across the island and felt nothing move in her but certainty. You're right that I need help, she said. I've needed help this whole time. I just finally noticed it was never going to come from you. She took the papers back. She'd file them herself. She'd already found the way. The next part she never told anyone the full truth of, not even later, not even the one person she came to trust completely. She left in November before the first hard snow, while Bennett was at a 3-day conference in Chicago. She'd arranged everything. The lawyer had the filing, the movers had a date. A fraction of what was legally hers was already quietly hers again. She packed 2 suitcases and the cello. She stood for a moment in the doorway of the house she'd kept immaculate for 8 years and felt no grief for it at all, which told her everything she needed to know about whether it had ever really been home. She drove east. It took her 4 days, because she stopped when her body told her to, and slept when she was tired and pulled over once, somewhere north of Fredericton, just to stand in the cold and breathe. She wasn't running from Bennett anymore by then. She was driving towards something older than him. She was 8 years old, and then 10, in the passenger seat while her mother sang along to the radio, the lupins nodding in the ditches, the salt smell coming up through the vents as they got close to the water. Marrow Cove hadn't changed as much as she'd feared. Smaller than she remembered, grayer, the fish plant long closed, half the saltbox houses leaning a little into the wind. But the harbor was the same steel blue, and the wharf her mother had laughed on was still standing. And when Camille got out of the car in front of the only cafe that was open past 4, the woman behind the counter looked her up and down and said, "You're not from here." "No," Camille said. "You've got city hands." The woman said it without malice, wiping the counter, a broad, weathered woman somewhere north of 70, with a gray braid and eyes that missed nothing. "What are you running from then?" And Camille, who had spent 8 years managing her face, managing every word, being pleasant and smooth and unreadable, surprised herself by telling the truth to a stranger in a fishing village. "My whole life," she said. "I think I'm running from my whole life." The woman set down her rag. Her name was Estelle Bourque, and she'd been born in that village and buried a husband and 2 sisters in it. And she looked at Camille for a long moment and then poured her a coffee she didn't charge for. "Sit down," Estelle said. "You look like you've been standing for about 10 years. That coffee was the beginning of everything that came after." Camille rented a salt box down by the water, the cheapest thing she could find, with a wood stove and a view of the harbor and a mudroom that smelled of 100 years of other people's rubber boots. The first winter was hard. She was still recovering, still on her medications, still learning her own heart the way you'd learn a new roommate. What it could take, what set it racing, what it needed. Some days she couldn't do much but sit by the stove and watch the water. But she rested, the way the doctor had told her to, and her old life never let her, and something in her that had been clenched for a decade slowly began to unclench. By spring she was strong enough to want to do something with her days. And she noticed the one empty storefront on the village's short main street, a former dry goods shop with a cracked window and good bones. She didn't have a business plan. She had her mother's stubbornness and a modest amount of money that was finally, unambiguously her own, and a memory of what it felt like to walk into a warm, bright place when you were cold and unmoored. She took the lease. She opened it as a little of everything, because the village needed a little of everything. Coffee, and fresh bread, and a shelf of second-shelf books, and a table by the window where the older men played crib, and a corner where the kids whose parents worked the boats or worked away in Alberta could do their homework after school under someone's eye. She called it nothing fancy. People called it Camille's, and then just the shop, and within a year it had become the thing every small dying town secretly runs on. A warm room where nobody was invisible. Estelle was there most days, sharp-tongued and merciless, and the closest thing to a mother Camille had had since she was 19. Estelle told her when the bread was underbaked, and when she was hiding, and when a man in the village was sweet on her and too shy to say so. Estelle was the one who found Camille in the back one afternoon, months in, sitting on an overturned crate with the cello between her knees. The case finally opened, playing the second movement of the Elgar for the first time in 5 years, with tears running down her face. Not sad tears. The other kind. The kind you cry when a part of yourself you thought was dead turns over and takes a breath. "Don't you dare stop," Estelle said from the doorway. "That's the best thing I've heard in this town in 40 years. So Camille started playing again, badly at first, and then not badly, and then teaching because a couple of the kids wanted to learn, and their families had nothing to pay a real teacher in the city, even if there'd been one within 2 hours. She taught them for free. She fed them when they were hungry, quietly, so they wouldn't feel it was charity. She bought a used violin off a marketplace listing in Halifax and drove 3 hours each way to get it, so a girl named after a grandmother could learn. She organized a Christmas concert in the church hall, that first December, that half the county turned out for. Kids scraping their way through carols, the older men crying into their collars, Estelle at the back, with her arms crossed and her chin trembling. She was, for the first time she could remember, entirely herself. She was not managing a single face in that hall. Her heart, the muscle, held steady through all of it. The cardiologist she now saw in Halifax told her at her spring checkup that her numbers had improved more than he'd expected, that whatever she was doing, she should keep doing it. She'd laughed. She was doing the one thing no doctor had thought to prescribe. She was living a life she actually wanted to be alive for. Back in Ontario, she heard in pieces, Bennett's life was going the other way. She didn't seek the news out. It came to her the way news does. A mutual acquaintance who tracked down the shop's number, an old neighbor who wrote a card. The divorce had gone through. Her lawyer had been very good and Bennett's rage very expensive. Brielle had not, as it turned out, been interested in Bennett Cross, the newly divorced man, with the wounded pride and the shrinking portfolio, nearly as much as she'd been interested in Bennett Cross, the powerful married partner she could rise beside. She'd moved to another firm within the year and taken 2 of his biggest clients with her. Without Camille running the machinery of his life, the dinners, the relationships, the endless invisible labor that had made his charm possible, a lot of the machinery seized up. Deals fell through. The house went on the market. She heard he'd started calling people, telling a version of the story where he was the injured party. A version that fewer and fewer people believed the longer. They didn't see Camille on his arm and started to wonder what he'd done to send her running to the far side of the country. She felt something reading those cards, but it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't grief either. It was closer to the way you feel watching a storm you've already driven out of, in your mirror, small and dark and far behind you. The gut punch when it came was not the one she'd braced for, and it didn't come from Bennett at all. Estelle got sick in the 3rd winter. It came on fast, the way it does at 80, and Camille, who had once been the one in the hospital bed being told to come home and clean, became the one who sat beside a hospital bed in Halifax for 11 days, holding a rough, warm hand and refusing to leave. She'd have burned the shop down before she'd have left. She read to Estelle. She brought the good coffee, smuggled in a thermos. She played for her, quietly, on a borrowed instrument in the corner of the room, until the nurses stopped pretending they minded. "You know what you did?" Estelle said to her one night, near the end, her voice a thread. "You gave this town back to itself. It was dying before you came. Half these kids had nowhere to be. You gave me back to myself," Camille said. "So we're even." Estelle laughed, which turned into a cough, which turned into her squeezing Camille's hand. "We're not even a little bit even," she said. "But that's how it's supposed to go. You don't pay it back, you pay it on." She died 3 days later, on a clear cold morning with the harbor like glass, and Camille grieved her the way she had never let herself grieve her own mother, out loud and completely, and without apology. The whole village came to the church hall. Camille played the Elgar, the second movement, the one you play when you've lost someone, and for the first time in her life she was surrounded by people who were listening. She stayed. Of course she stayed. She'd promised Estelle she'd keep the shop going, and she kept it going. and she kept teaching the kids for free. And every dollar the shop made past what she needed to live went back into the town the way Estelle had shown her. A coat for a kid, groceries left on a porch, a repair no one asked her to pay for. She was not a saint about it. She'd have been the first to say so. She just knew now what the money was for, which was more than her mother had ever gotten the chance to learn, and more than Bennett would understand if he lived to be 100. He came, in the end. She'd always half known he would. It was a raw April afternoon, the lupins not up yet, the harbor the color of old nickels. And she looked up from the counter of the shop. And there he was in the doorway, and he looked smaller than she remembered. Older. The confidence sanded off him. He'd tracked her down, he said. He'd been thinking. He'd made mistakes. He could see that now. He'd been under so much pressure back then, and things hadn't worked out the way he'd planned. And he looked around the little shop, at the mismatched chairs, at the crib board, at the drawings the kids had taped to the window, and she watched him fail entirely to understand what he was looking at. He saw a small, poor room in a dying town. He didn't see the thing that had saved her life. "You could come home, Cam," he said. "We could figure it out. You don't belong out here. Look at this place." She looked at it. She looked at the whole warm, bright room she'd built with her own 2 hands, out of the ruins of the life he'd nearly ended her inside. The men at the crib table had gone quiet, watching. Through the window she could see 2 of her students coming up the road with their instrument cases, on time for once. "I am home," she said. "This is exactly where I belong. You just never once in your life could tell the difference between where I belonged and where you needed me to be." She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you tell someone the weather, and she watched it land on him at last. Not the divorce, not the money, not even the loss of his standing back in the city, but this, the sight of her, alive and well and loved, in a life he had nothing to do with and could never have given her. She watched him understand, 3 years too late, standing in a doorway on the far edge of the country, exactly what he had thrown away when she'd been lying alone in that hospital bed, and all he could think about was the powder room. He didn't stay long. There was nothing to stay for. She heard later that he sold what was left and moved out west and started over. And she hoped, without much heat, that he found whatever he was looking for. She had stopped needing him to be punished. Living well had turned out to be its own quiet verdict, delivered not in a courtroom but in the plain fact of her happiness, and he'd had to stand in her doorway and read it for himself. Camille Fortier is 40 now. Her heart, the muscle, is stronger than the doctors once feared it could be. Though she's careful with it. Careful in the way you're careful with something you've fought to keep. The shop is still there on the short main street of Marrow Cove, warmer and brighter every year. The first crop of kids she taught for free are grown now. One of them plays in an orchestra in Halifax and comes home every Christmas to play in the church hall. And every time, Camille cries the good kind of tears at the back of the room with her arms crossed, exactly the way Estelle used to. Sometimes, on the clear evenings, she takes the cello down to the wharf where her mother once laughed with a stranger, and she plays for the water and the wind and no one at all. And she thinks about Odile, who never got out, who folded herself small until her heart gave out under the weight of a life that was never allowed to be hers. She thinks that maybe you don't pay a thing like that back. You pay it on. She thinks that somewhere, if there's anywhere, her mother is finally standing up straight and listening, that she got out after all, a generation late, carried on the back of a daughter who was almost too frightened to run, and then, one gray night in a hospital bed, decided to run anyway. And she plays until the light is gone off the water, and then she packs up the cello and walks home through the salt air to a life she chose, in the one place on earth that finally, unmistakably, belonged to her.